Hello. As some of you know, I double majored in philosophy and psychology in university, with a minor in business management and Bible. I know. Before Peterson's brain melted into a goopy mess, I was drawn to Peterson in 2017, and that's embarrassing to say, but it's now on recording, as he combined Carl Jung's archetypes and theory of unconscious with media analysis and biblical parallels. I found myself drifting away from him, however, as I listened, as it became clear that there was a fundamental disconnect in his interpretations from what I was actually learning about Jung. Unfortunately, as Peterson has made himself into a household name, people reasonably have had to put a lot of his bad ideas through the ringer over time, and I think in that process, Carl Jung gets hit with a few strays, at least in some YouTube videos I've seen covering him. People just assume. They already know they don't like Freud, and they know, well, maybe they don't know, but Carl Jung is a student of Freud, and so maybe they just associate it all? I don't know. Personally, I love Carl Jung. I own multiple books of his writings, studied him in university. Not to say that his works are gospel or that I agree with him on everything, but he's a very interesting thinker that I think is important. And as many of you who subscribed here know, I did a 14-hour series breaking down Persona 4 a few years ago, as the entire Persona series is intertwined with Jungian ideas made literal. So as someone whose wits are about me enough to tell the difference between a milking video and a Chinese torture facility, let me pit Carl Jung against Jordan Peterson more specifically, and show ways that Peterson often mutilates Jung's ideas to argue things entirely counter to Jung's beliefs. Jung's stance on social hierarchies and Peterson's cobbled together attachment to his own ideology. The issue is, it explicitly uses the language of meaning to guide mostly lost young men into chaos and away from self-actualization. One of the key points that Peterson emphasizes is about the nature of social order, biologically hardwired hierarchies and social systems, and often he uses Jung as the sort of centerpiece, the grounding block, and wields it as a sort of pseudo-supernatural tool to gesture to the nature of reality and give it some foundation in psychology, at least on the surface. Think of the lobster analogies. Now, even taking Jung out of the picture, this is what Hume called an is-ought fallacy in reasoning. We're not focused on that though. The issue, to me, is just how transparently it isn't what Jung wrote. Jung viewed societal norms and structures with a distant ambivalence, emphasizing individual psychology and development over conformity to any social hierarchy. He proposed that the method by which true individuation takes shape often involves the targeted questioning and transcendence from social expectations. This isn't even controversial. Listen to Jung in his own words. One cannot individuate as long as one is playing the role to oneself. The convictions one has about oneself are the most subtle form of persona, and the most subtle obstacle against any true individuation. One can admit practically anything, yet somewhere one retains the idea that one is nevertheless so-and-so. And this is always a sort of final argument which counts apparently as a plus, yet it functions as an influence against true individuation. It is the most painful procedure to tear off those veils. But each step toward psychological development means just that, the tearing off of a new veil. We are like onions with many skins, and we peel ourselves again and again in order to get at the real core. Jung spoke to the processes toward individuation as a self-reflective, reconstructive process, one that challenges fundamental biases and the unconscious ways that one constructs themselves within a societal framework. The rubric for self-improvement is the refinement of one's awareness of the world and your place within it, and a transcendence of the social expectation by not allowing yourself to slip into the unconscious habit of a modern person. Specifically, Jung saw these societal structures as regressive behaviors which lean on unconscious biological development, and are not chosen for unbiased or self-actualized reasons. They are happenstance, and not a part of you, nor can you find your best self in coherence with your unconscious habits of a societal structure. To take this framework and turn it into set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world is, I hope, self-evidently fraud. To quote Jung, projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. So I would argue it is not merely misinterpretation, it's twisting Jung's words to say the precise opposite, which mainly has to do with Peterson's whole redefinition and associations with the place of order and chaos. Peterson often emphasizes the importance of existing social hierarchies in traditional structures, suggesting that they are a mere reflection of the natural moral order, or a divine moral order, where coherence to it is an act towards order. If you were to put their positions into logical syllogisms, they would be arguing the opposite things here. But this is just the surface to Peterson's strange adoption of the order-chaos framework, and I also will come back to more of this point once other pieces have come together. Jung introduced archetypes as a universal primordial collection of concepts and motifs that arise from the collective unconscious, as a result of beings trying to make sense of their own reality. You see a lot of people split on two paths here, which I think is why Jung can be controversial. One is purely biological and scientific. That is, that the motifs in human consciousness are a necessary result of the reasoning faculties making sense of the multitude of variables that happen within the world. That these ideas and concepts take on anthropomorphization and make their influence in the ways that a human brain can more easily digest, in order to convey complex ideas about reality and their solutions in the form of myths, stories, and narrative structures. The prevalence and reproducibility of archetypes across cultures giving us better insight into the most fundamental ways that a brain operates. The second major group are more like Peterson, although I wouldn't associate them just inherently, who take this underlying collective similarity in the functioning of unconscious thought and give it an explicitly divine or supernatural weight. Essentially, one group says, "This thing seems to exist. What it is, we are unsure, but it may provide good insights if we analyze it further." And Peterson's takeaway seems to be, "This is a thing that seems to exist. It is more powerful and transcendent than anything else. Therefore, it must be linked to the divine will of God." And so a sort of pseudo-pantheistic, pseudo-psychological worldview is formed. I think that's partially why Peterson's statements on God seem to be all over the place throughout the years, and famously, for a while, they were really trying to pin him on claiming to be a Christian, because he wouldn't claim it. And eventually he would claim it, but the way he would describe it was very, not accepted by, any Christian. Anyways, there's also a weird malignment and mischaracterization of order and chaos along gender markers with Peterson's work. To reiterate, Jung introduced the archetypes as a universal set of motifs that can have infinite different variations and changes, and that arise from the collective unconscious working on our own psychology and our life situations. When we read a myth from a certain culture or time period, it tells us things about the psyche of those people. He did not rigidly associate masculinity with order and the feminine with chaos, as Peterson relentlessly does. Jung is surprisingly charming in his writings and explicit about the forces for chaos neither being causally tied to the traits of one's femininity or masculinity. In Archetypes of the Collective Subconscious, Jung writes, "Archetypes are complexes of experience that come upon us like fate, and their effects are felt in our most personal life. The anima no longer crosses our path as a goddess, but it may be, as an intimately personal misadventure, or perhaps as our best venture." So he makes it clear that while there are archetypal situations where the agents of chaos leading one astray is a female to a male, a famous example we all know is beautiful sirens luring older male sailors to the rocks. There are plenty of archetypal stories where the sex is reversed, though. In fact, Jung laid out very predominant examples of the gender markers in adherence to order and chaos, either being arbitrary or contingent aspects of these characters. One such example is in Jung's archetype of the wise old woman, a character whose wisdom is inherent in the eternal feminine form. This character is often a guiding figure whose role is to provide guidance and direction, either literally but more often spiritually. An even more obvious counterexample given by Jung is the archetype of the trickster, who is portrayed almost always as a male figure who disrupts the social order, challenges norms and the status quo, and introduces chaos into established hierarchies and systems. This is the underlying reason that the protagonist of the Persona games are always the fool archetype, the trickster, because the course by which one self-actualizes themselves in Jung is by understanding and thereby transcending the world, through coming across the various archetypes which present themselves across time and narrative immemorial. It's the hero's journey in its truest form, a story of actualization of the subconscious for all, liberating beyond social conventions and boundaries into their actualized selves. Both of these extremely prominent and common examples illustrate Jung's archetypes do not confine order to femininity and chaos to masculinity, or, like Peterson pushes, as vice versa, but that instead they reflect a more nuanced understanding that both order and chaos are intrinsic to various archetypal figures, regardless of gender markers or sex. Peterson, on the other hand, in 12 Rules of Life, states, "Order and chaos are the yang and the yin of the famous Taoist symbol. Two serpents, head to tail. Order is the white, masculine serpent. Chaos is the black, feminine counterpart." So, I include this because I doubt that what I'm saying is a controversial representation of Peterson's views. Anyone who finds themselves to have engaged directly with Peterson or seen enough people respond to him might find this long quote unnecessary. He capitalizes on the intuitive aspects of Jung to reason towards unconscious bias, in direct affront to Jungian individuation. The active goal for the transcendence Peterson approaches is to fall back into the regressive subconscious. The example he gives of Mother Nature, wrapping together protection of an ability to provide and mixing it with childbirth and the place from which new life is formed, is heavily abstracted and not staying consistent to principles. The archetypes are how the human psyche reasons, understands, and hypothesizes the nature of reality to ourselves. They don't represent truth itself, but the unconscious means by which our brains attempt to make sense of reality. Because of the nature of what archetypes are, they are the building blocks to narrative structure. Of course, you can cobble together archetypes and make any point you want to, which is why Jung didn't do this. Here's an analogy. You go into a sandwich shop and go through the line of saying what things you do and do not want on your sandwich. People get different sandwiches to fit their own personal tastes. Not only that, depending on the day, any number of factors, they may, in fact, get a different sandwich. They might be in the mood. One day I'm in for a BLT, one for, This is because different situations are constructed of different narrative elements that together say different things about the nature of the narrative, reality, or the storyteller themselves. Rather than seeing these aspects to a larger situational problem, Peterson seems to make a sandwich under very narrow conditions, the same way each time, and sees coherence to this specific hypothetical sandwich as a moral imperative. Or maybe a better visualization. Peterson is the guy in that one short that makes all of the differently shaped wooden blocks go into the same hole. Any breadth of interpretation that varies beyond Peterson's rigid ideology is either pruned or ignored. So put simply, Peterson's binary association simplifies Jung's more nuanced understanding of archetypal energies, potentially reinforcing gender stereotypes that Jung's framework does not inherently support and in fact actively goes against. Peterson has a lot of weird gender stuff going on in his work though, and I feel comfortable in coldly stating that Peterson pushes anti-scientific, misogynistic beliefs that do not actually adhere to modern psychological understanding, or reality. But that's actually a much more substantially covered topic than the actual intellectual misrepresentations of Jung that Peterson can't help but flirt with. Going on then, let's talk a bit about integration versus opposition to one's shadow concept. Jung's concept of the shadow encompasses all aspects of the personality that the conscious ego does not identify with, both negative and positive traits. Integrating the shadow involves acknowledging and assimilating these hidden aspects of ourselves to achieve psychological wholeness. Again, we saw this with my Persona 4 analysis. Each character first rejects the negative aspects of themselves. Then, once they have fought against and engaged with themselves, they eventually accept that this part of themselves does exist and lurk, not excusing the behavior, but honestly reflecting on it and using the awareness of that trait to actively choose to become the person that you want to be. Here's another quote from Jung's seminal work, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. Real liberation comes not from glossing over or repressing painful states of feeling, but only from experiencing them to the full. And maybe a contextually appropriate quote from the same work that highlights the problem of Peterson's misrepresentation would be nice too. So, here Jung states, "Were it not for the leaping and twinkling of his soul, man would rot away in his greatest passion, idleness." This quote underlies the goal shift of the clean your room mindset from Jung's point. Jung wanted us to engage with the very basis from which our consciousness exists, to understand that as we actively correct our nature from the unconscious habitual states that stop individuation, we necessarily must both criticize the world and ourselves. If we take the room or house metaphor Peterson's famous for as the individuation of a person, the process of this cleaning requires ripping up the floorboards. It requires a full, actual, deep clean. It requires a full, honest conversation about what is and isn't dirty, what is and isn't a good highlight in the room for decorating. It takes directive, and Peterson is trying to fuel the individuation process with idleness. It's philosophical snake oil, literally using the packaging of cancer remedy and filling the bottle with more cancer. It's a logically incoherent statement. Given Jung's actual statements on how one becomes an individual, colloquially, you should make sure that your head is on straight before you go out the door. So, in that sense, of course what Peterson says is true. But when you are speaking to the collective subconscious, you are necessarily talking about the reality of human nature as a whole, not merely to your own experience. Even simpler, you don't clean your room before you criticize the world. The nature of the world and your room are inseparably intertwined with one another. This integration of the shadow as a heightened means for comprehending your own nature is a key part of the individuation process laid out by Jung, and gratefully by some more accessible works like Persona, where it actually does a good job at appropriating these ideas in a way that people can understand. Peterson unfortunately often interprets the integration of the shadow as embracing one's capacity for aggression and dominance in a hierarchical structure. So rather than break and transcend unconscious regression, you become master of the crap pile, basically. Peterson often talks about becoming a monster. How only in realizing one is a monster, they can control and take responsibility with it. This actually isn't an awful characterization of the shadow, despite my mocking tone. But in making the idea more accessible to, lost guys who want to have direction in their life, it's lost a lot of crucial nuance. The shadow is a lot broader than a representation for inner aggression and dominance. People desire control over their surroundings, and due to insecurity, try to enact authority to greater or lesser degrees. Integrating the shadow isn't about taking some dark shadow monster version of yourself and integrating more aspects of that into who you are with intentionality. It's understanding why you have those sorts of feelings lurking deep down in the first place. Asking what the nature of those feelings are, where they are coming from, and understanding them in order to gain better grasp over the unconscious biases that you express in your day-to-day. Peterson is pulling from dominance hierarchies in nature as proof, while totally ignoring Jung's critique of the unconscious biodeterminism. Like I said, Peterson is somehow taking the individuation process and actively interpreting it into the opposite of its point. Not to reintegrate with unconscious, idle, habitual behavior that acts unjust and unreasonably, but to understand why the nature of certain feelings you have are yours, and take a hard look at how they express your understanding of reality on a base level. So while Peterson engages with an idea of a darker version of yourself, it narrows the broader spectrum described by Jung into primarily aggressive traits, which are also associated with order and masculinity. Moving forward again, let's focus on the specific oddities in the differences between Peterson and Dr. Carl Jung's perspectives on religious archetypal frameworks. Jung approached religious symbols as an expression of inner psychological processes, viewing them as metaphors for the journey toward individuation and self-understanding. Jung was deeply well-read in religious thinkers of history, such as Augustine. Those reasonings sometimes are even accepted by Jung, and Augustine is only mentioned or cited just to bring up his argument. This also is partially an effect of the time period, but he also sometimes refers to the Catholic saints by their titles, such as referring to Paul as Saint Paul. But he also describes subconsciousness itself as a sort of god, or of repeating the archetype of a maximally powerful being as a god. The supernatural force of claim is entirely within the proposed idea of the subconscious mind, not necessarily directed by any sort of personal will or conscious lawgiver. Peterson again bends elements of Jung's view into Peterson's perfect sandwich. Peterson often treats religious narratives as an essential framework for moral behavior and societal order, emphasizing the literal function and roles for guiding individual conduct, rather than justifying the particulars. This pragmatic lens for engaging with biblical literature always focuses in on one particular interpretation, rather than seeing how all elements play into each other, such as the history, the mindset of the culture, the circumstances they are under. This assertion of one's own bias, without considering the broader field, is a point where Peterson subtly takes off his science hat and replaces it with an apologetics hat for an extremely niche and strange interpretation of a vaguely Christian divine being, if you can even call it that. Part of Jung's argument is how the archetypes show up in different forms, across different contexts, across different time periods, across history, meaning almost definitionally no singular text can be the best guiding light or the one that gets it most correct, because you have no rubric for judging that, but instead offers merely another insight into the nature of the human psyche. Peterson, instead, clings particularly close to a Christianity that he states he thinks it represents the archetypes most clearly, something that doesn't even make sense in a Jungian context. Something he has never substantiated to anything approaching satisfactory detail, but which should be the primary priority, if he's being honest to others and himself. It rests very heavy on an is-ought fallacy that deals with modern global religious climate and equates it as a permanent truth consistent with all existence, despite the reign in Mesopotamia, to Egypt, to Greece. All before Christianity existed, it's basically a transparently flaccid appeal to popularity that only makes sense for this particular time period. It's an argument that could get you laughed out of the room. To the next point, Jung and Peterson vary significantly on the individuation journey and social conformity. As I've already mentioned somewhat, but we're going to focus in on this part now. To quote Jung, "Man becomes whole, integrated, calm, fertile, and happy when, and only when, the process of individuation is complete, when the conscious and the unconscious have learned to live at peace, and to complement one another." The process of individuation by Jung is a deeply personal process, integrating various aspects of the psyche in order to achieve self-realization, and often requires the negotiation and divergence with social norms and structures. On the contrary, let's look at Peterson's quote, although there are countless similar versions of it. "It is in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life." Now, responsibility is a generally great, virtuous trait, but Peterson's usage mirrors a sort of work will set you free type of take on responsibility. I think foremost in responsibility, we have the responsibility to ourselves and a responsibility to the world to operate in a way that we feel is the most true and accurate. To take proper account of what is true, take responsibility. Responsibility to something that isn't true is irreverence. If I'm being too cryptic, what Peterson is doing here is, within a societal framework, proposing that one's responsibilities granted to them in their societal circumstances should be adhered to effectively as a way to fight your way up the ladder of social dominance and hierarchy. The structures of hierarchy themselves are, as we've covered, unjustified by Peterson, merely assumed to be true and supported with Jung, but Jung fundamentally does not see things the same way. If you ask Jung about Peterson's meaning through responsibility framework, the first reaction someone practicing Jungian thought would have, I think, or would hope, is to ask about the nature of the framework first off, to take responsibility to make sure that your foundational confidence in a particular framework is sound and valid, and not a product of biases, or worse, the unconscious regressive habitual behavior of a totally non-individualized person. I know this is a dense topic, but I hope that I've straddled the line on information, clarity, and moments of focus. Why this bothered me is that Jordan Peterson's interpretations of Jungian concepts often reflect a focus on societal structures and their functional behavior, massively deviates from Jung's emphasis on individual psychological exploration and the integration of the unconscious. I hoped to emphasize that some of these key distinguishing aspects between how Peterson wields Jung to support his off-base, half-constructed, or even sometimes objectively incorrect claims, and Jung doesn't even reflect many of these sentiments. He's building his house on sand. I say this because differing from Jung is not bad. I disagree or interpret some of his work on my own as well, and in my own personal view and how I integrate and understand his works. But constructing moral narratives with archetypes, and then ascribing the morality of the narrative you constructed to Jung, is like purchasing the place the sandwich shop used to be at, keeping the same branding, the same name, but you can only put your perfect sandwich on the menu, and claiming that you're just new management running things just like the last guy did. But you're lying, and your sandwich is awful.